Hey there, and welcome to The Story. I'm Ashley Korslund in for Pat Doris tonight. I want to start with this. There's a plan taking shape in the Oregon legislature to set aside $1 billion that would fund our state's portion of replacing the I-5 bridge. Lawmakers on the Joint Transportation Committee have signaled that they're willing to put up the money, but they want to know more about what exactly they're buying. And that means we're learning some interesting details about what the replacement bridge could look like, how it'll be built, and how much each piece of the project is going to cost. We're going to dive into the nitty-gritty on the I-5 bridge replacement for tonight's big story. All right, let's start with the bridge design. Around this time last year, the Interstate Bridge Replacement Team, or IBR team, released what's called the Locally Preferred Alternative that laid out their recommendations for some of the broadest details about the project based on public feedback and input from local governments and agencies. And here's what they decided. So number one, the bridge should be a fixed crossing. That means it doesn't move, no more drawbridge. Number two, it should have 4 lanes in each direction for a total of 8. The current bridge has 6 lanes total, and the old failed Columbia River crossing plan, well, that was going to have 10, so this plan just splits the difference. Number 3, it should include light rail, extending the Max Yellow line to downtown Vancouver. And number 4, it should shrink the interchange on Hayden Island so it only serves Washington traffic. Oregon drivers, well, they would reach the island on a new local bridge separate from the freeway. So with that plan in mind, the bridge team started the federal environmental evaluation and approval process. That is still ongoing, but it's revealed a few wrinkles, let's say. The Coast Guard, for one, is not happy about the proposed height of the new bridge. It wants the team to study a new drawbridge plan to give big boats more clearance. And the bridge team is also considering the old Columbia River crossing's 10-lane configuration instead of just 8. The IBR administrator's name is Greg Johnson, and at a hearing this month, he confirmed that they're looking at both 8 and 10-lane versions as part of this federal evaluation process. Okay, now let's talk about the big picture design. No matter what version we end up with, drawbridge, fixed bridge, 8-lane, 10, well, the replacement bridge is going to be a twin-span structure, just like the current bridge. That means it's technically going to be 2 bridges side by side, one for southbound traffic and light rail, and the other for northbound traffic and a bike and pedestrian path. Johnson says it's become clear that a single bridge just would not be practical.
Because once you get that wide, having one bridge, you get limited to the type of bridge you can construct. So we want to make sure we're giving any contractor some flexibility in bridge type to save us dollars in the future.
Now let's talk about what those spans could look like. The width of these structures came up during that recent hearing in Salem, including a back and forth when Representative Con Pham pressed Johnson to give a specific number.
I just wanted to follow up on my question to make sure I get the clear answer. What is the width of the bridge structure? So not the lanes or adding it up, but just the entire bridge structure. What is the total width?
So we double checked this with Johnson, so we want to break down the answer. A standard freeway lane is 12 feet wide, and each span would have either 4 or 5 of them. Each span is also going to have 12-foot or 14-foot shoulders on each side, according to Johnson. The possible extra 2 feet, well, that's because the team is looking at having the inner shoulders double as bus lanes. So what's 12 times 4 for the actual lanes plus 14 times 2 for the shoulders? Don't worry, we're going to save you the mental math. It is 76 feet per bridge span, or 152 feet total, not counting the gap between the 2 spans. So add in the extra pair of lanes. In this case, they're called auxiliary lanes, and it would be 88 feet per span and 176 feet total. Are you still with us here? Okay, for a real-life reference point, the Interstate 205 Glen Jackson Bridge has 4 lanes and 2 shoulders on each side, and it's a little less than 150 feet wide. So now you'll notice that this talk about width hasn't included light rail tracks or bike and pedestrian space. Well, that's because most of those parts may end up getting tucked away on lower decks. If you remember the Columbia River crossing project, that was the plan back then. Twin spans with light rail on one of the lower decks and the bike and pedestrian path on the other. But it could also end up on one deck, in which case it would stretch that width even farther. 2 light rail tracks on one span and a bike path, pedestrian path on the other.
Both are still on the table. We're going to look at the benefits and the drawbacks and trade-offs of each scenario. And that's some of the things that we're going to be asking the public to weigh in as we work towards getting our draft supplemental document out towards the end of the year.
The twin span approach also gives the flexibility to build each span one at a time, with the trade-off being that the overall construction timeline would stretch out to as much as 8 years.
Because we're maintaining traffic on the existing bridge, we're going to build approximately a 100-foot gap and build one of the new bridges and get that bridge built, shift traffic to that, and then build the second span, which may have some overlap with the existing bridge. So there'll be part of that old bridge that may have to be taken out sometime probably in the 2030, 2031 timeframe to accommodate that second new bridge being built right next to it.
And to be clear, when he says shift traffic to the new bridge, well, he means traffic for both directions. So we build the new southbound span starting in 2026. Then we move all I-5 traffic northbound and southbound to that one bridge. And then we demolish the original bridges in 2030 or 2031. Then we would hypothetically build out the new northbound span and move northbound traffic over to that, probably sometime between 2031 and 2033, according to Johnson. So there could be a couple really painful years in there when all that traffic is crammed onto one bridge. And I know I can hear you now because I drive this very bridge every day. Both directions of traffic running on a bridge designed for just 4 lanes. Yeah, great. So it'll be even worse than it is now. That's what you're probably thinking. Well, according to Johnson, it might not be quite that bad. Remember those 14-foot shoulders they're looking at? Well, those could be used as temporary lanes, but it would still be a crunch, and that's why Johnson says light rail on the southbound span would be important in reducing congestion.
If we can get light rail up and running, we will have another relief valve for folks who don't want to sit in the traffic, in the construction traffic.
Now here's the big thing. Let's talk about money here. The idea of light rail on the bridge has really been a hot topic, with some discussion in the recent hearing wondering how much money could be saved by cutting it out of the plan. The price tag right now is between $1.3 to $2 billion for just light rail alone. But Greg Johnson told us that around $1 billion of the federal dollars the team hopes to line up would be from the Federal Transit Administration, which essentially means it would be for light rail specifically. And the inclusion of light rail could also increase a separate federal pot of money for the bridge itself, is what he says. So yanking light rail, that component, out of the project wouldn't be nearly as large or as clean cut as you think it might be. And when we're looking at the entire cost of the bridge replacement project, the latest estimate is $6 billion, give or take $1 billion, which obviously is quite a range. But at the hearing about 2 weeks ago, we got to see what you might call an itemized bill of sorts, listing out the costs of light rail that we just told you about, as well as other pieces of the project. Now, the bridge alone, as in the twin spans over the Columbia, nothing else, is about $1.5 to $2.5 billion. But the IBR's team's plan also calls for rebuilding or upgrading 7 of the surrounding I-5 interchanges, 4 on the Washington side and 3 on the Oregon side. Plus, they've also got to build that extra local bridge that would detour the traffic from Oregon over Hayden Island area. Now, the Washington side upgrades are about $1 to $1.5 billion, and the Oregon side upgrades come out to be about the same cost. So the IBR team's funding plan calls for Oregon and Washington to each kick in $1 billion, and then the federal government to throw us, optimistically, at least $2.5 billion, with the remaining $1 billion plus dollars paid through tolls. But even for the baseline, that $6 billion estimate, that is a lot of money. And Oregon lawmakers, they seem pretty interested in finding a way to keep that bill from going any higher. Draft legislation from the Joint Transportation Committee includes a provision stating that the overall cost of the project, quote, may not exceed $6.3 billion. The legislation isn't final yet, but the cap provision, that appears to be serious. Committee co-chair Susan McLean was one of the ones who drafted the plan, and she told us earlier this month that she specifically sought to include that cap. When we asked Representative Pham about the idea, she said not only that does she support the cap, but she wants it to have even more teeth. She said that's why she's also pushing so hard to nail down the width of the bridge. That's because she's concerned about the scale and the cost of the project going up.
My ideal version is just building the I-5 bridge replacement. That's the name of it. We should replace the I-5 bridge. We should build great public transit on the bridge so we have a climate-friendly alternative, and that's it. But I don't think we need to add on these freeway on-ramps, multi-story on-ramps that are going to be both very expensive. It's half the size of the project is actually these freeway approaches.
Okay, so that's her opinion. Well, we asked Greg Johnson about that, and he said it's not that simple. Part of why we need to rebuild the interchanges is that no matter which configuration we end up with, the new bridge is going to be higher up than the old one. So on the Washington side, I-5 ducks underneath a train line right before the bridge, which means you can't raise the freeway just a little bit. You have to raise it high enough to go over the train tracks, which is high enough to make rebuilding the interchange unavoidable, essentially. Some of the other interchanges are more than a mile up the road from the bridge. So do those need upgrades too? Well, we'll leave that up to you. And this kind of public scrutiny is good, Pham argues, because now is the time when Oregon has the greatest leverage to influence the scale of this project. Once construction is underway, it gets a lot harder to hit the brakes or even to scale down if things do go over budget.
We need to make sure we're right sizing the design so we're not stuck halfway with a halfway overbuilt project. Because we all know once we start building a bridge, it's very difficult to change course or to stop building it. Obviously, nobody wants to do that.
And of course, not everybody in the legislature agrees on what a right-sized bridge looks like, but there does seem to be a shared recognition that if you want to haggle over specific pieces of the project, right now is the time to do it.
I would immediately, from a knee-jerk reaction, say I really like the idea of 2 auxiliary lanes, not 1. If we're going to go to all this trouble, let's put them all in there.
Now, there is urgency outside of the legislature as well. The Joint Transportation Committee is scheduled to hold a public hearing on the financial part of it, the finance plan, tomorrow afternoon. And local advocacy groups have been urging their members to show up and voice support for a revised plan with a smaller scale project and stronger financial guardrails to put in place. So when will we have concrete answers on all of this? I know we've been talking about this for a while. But I hope you're patient because it likely won't be until the end of next year, pending federal approval. So what's going through your mind right now? I know that we just told you a lot. There were a lot of numbers, a lot of data, and it was a lot to digest. But the future of the I-5 crossing is really a big deal. And we pride ourselves in getting into the details that few others would really have the courage to do on a local news show. So we want you to send us your thoughts, your opinions. Email thestory@kgw.com, or you can call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090. All right, still to come on The Story, we're learning more about Portland's new plan to create zero-emission loading zones downtown. What on earth does that mean, you might ask? And will it even have an impact on commerce in the downtown area? Environmental reporter Cale Williams joins us to explain when The Story returns. The city of Portland has a new plan to create zero-emission loading zones downtown. Basically means that there's a chunk of town where delivery vehicles will have to be zero emission in order to drop stuff off, or else they face fines. You probably have a lot of questions already, and so did we, of course. There was a press conference today to unveil the plan. Environmental reporter Cale Williams was there and got some answers.
The mood was high in downtown Portland.
Can we get a round of applause for that?
As Portland City Commissioner Mingus Mapps announced a new federal grant.
I am pleased to announce that the Portland Bureau of Transportation has been awarded a $2 million SMART grant to help create a safer, cleaner, and more equitable system for delivering goods and services right here in downtown Portland.
The grant will fund the creation of 3 new zero-emissions loading zones in downtown Portland, and officials say they'll serve 16 city blocks. The idea is to encourage delivery companies like FedEx, UPS, and Amazon to adopt electric vehicles through cash incentives. That's according to Dylan Rivera, a spokesman for the Portland Bureau of Transportation.
This is an innovative way to see if we can start to use smaller, cleaner, greener vehicles to have less pollution, less carbon emissions, and safer streets.
And by smaller vehicles, Rivera was referring to electric tricycles. The city plans to partner with a company called Beeline, which has a warehouse on the Central East Side where larger, non-electric trucks can drop off deliveries. Jacob Sherman, also with PBOT, explained while showing off one of the company's electric tricycles.
They're delivering into the Central East Side at their warehouse, and then those goods get unpackaged from those big vehicles, loaded in onto these bikes, and then off into the city.
But what the pilot program won't do is almost as important as what it will.
We're just proposing to change how we regulate these 3 loading zones. So it's about 40 feet of the curb space at 3 locations right outside the Portland Building, the Federal Building, and the Multnomah County Courthouse.
Services like DoorDash and Instacart won't be affected, and all other street traffic will remain the same. We reached out to UPS, FedEx, and Amazon. An Amazon rep told us they do have some electric vans already in use in the Portland area, but none of the 3 companies responded to our specific questions. So I asked Rivera if he'd been in touch with local businesses to see if they supported the plan. He said that they were involved in the proposal process and the city would continue to be in touch as the plan progresses. I also asked Rivera if he was worried that this could increase cost to shippers, who would then pass that along to consumers.
That's something we're hoping to learn. We're all ears for hearing about every impact to shippers, to businesses, and to consumers.
And what about the argument that this move could just shift all that traffic and pollution to the Beeline warehouse on the east side?
You know, that's something we're concerned about. I think we'll wait and see, and we'll hear from Beeline, how their deliveries are going.
Now, this is the first time anything like this will be attempted anywhere in the U.S., and everyone who spoke at the press conference was adamant that this is very much an experiment. Still, even with all the unknowns, interim PBOT Director Tara Wasiak was optimistic.
I am very confident that PBOT will make the first regulated zero-emission delivery zone in the United States a success.
And Cale joins me now in studio. So Cale, this sounds like a pretty ambitious plan.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it is true that this is the first time that anything like this has been tried in the U.S. There's a couple cities in Europe that have tried it. First time here in this country. But it is also only 3 loading zones in downtown, a total of 120 feet of curb space. So I don't think anybody's going to wake up the day after this goes into effect and find, their packages undeliverable.
So a question I have is this going to be enforceable? Will people even follow the rules?
Well, that remains to be seen. It will be enforceable. Whether people will follow the rules or not, we shall see. I mean, what Dylan Rivera told me was that the same people who give out tickets to everybody else will be looking for people in traditional diesel trucks at these loading zones, and if they're there, you get a citation.
So what about the impact? Obviously, it's to cut down on emissions, but what do officials expect to happen with this?
Yeah, well, it's to cut down on emissions and to provide a safer area to walk downtown with fewer trucks. I remain a little skeptical that this is going to make a huge dent in climate change or pedestrian safety. Like I said, just 3 loading zones. But this is a pilot program, so they're hoping to see what the best practices are, what works, what doesn't, and then if things do work, possibly expand these zones.
Yeah, it's a start, right?
It's a start.
All right, Cale, thank you.
My pleasure.
And still ahead on the story, as gas tax revenues decline for ODOT because of electric vehicles and hybrids, does the state have a backup plan for ODOT money other than tolling? Well, they sure do, but it's a pilot program that's been going on for years and is still years away from implementation. We'll explain when the story returns. Well, last night we brought you a story about anti-tolling bills in the Oregon legislature. We had heard that those bills were effectively dead, according to a presentation by Representative Susan McLean to the Willamette Women Democrats meeting earlier this month. Now, we couldn't find a recording of that meeting, so we went to McLean directly for an answer. She told us that the bills are still alive and have until next Friday to get a work session scheduled. But there's some nuance to what she said in our interview. Basically, that tolling is a tool the legislature is crafting and expanding on. So even though the bills are alive, we don't expect them to move forward. One viewer eloquently said in an email that the bills are in a legislatively induced coma. Now, we know that many of you are against tolling, and we asked the lawmaker what she would say to those of you. Her response: give it a chance. So we asked you for your thoughts on tolling, and if anything Rep. McLean said changed your mind. Got a couple responses. So Steve wrote to us, she knows that if you give tolling a chance, he wouldn't be able to get rid of it because it'll be in. And we also got this voicemail from Curtis.
I just watched a segment on the lady that was defending tolling in Oregon or other states, and how she said that once it was in, people were happy that it came in. I've lived on the east side of the United States, and people over there hate tolling. And when she said they found more ways to travel, that meant that they were going down side streets to avoid tolls. So if she thinks that people are happy with tolls, she's delusional in my mind, but that's just my opinion.
Some strong sentiments there. Well, there certainly is also a portion of you who are not adamantly against tolling. You kind of understand, I guess, why it may be needed. David says convenient, uncongested motor vehicle expressways are not created and maintained with fairy dust. Those who demand and use them ought to pay for them. Now, obviously, this all comes down to money, right? Money from the public to go to ODOT for maintenance and upgrades to the areas that it wants to toll. We got a voicemail from a man named Michael that we wanted to address tonight concerning this very issue.
My question is, have any of the anti-tolling groups or people who have commented to you figured out a way to make up for ODOT's loss of revenue due to the reduction in gas tax revenue because of the hybrids and EVs?
Good question. So the short answer is we've not seen any concrete plans for additional ODOT revenue from the groups or people who don't want tolls. But the state has been working on a pilot project for over a decade to make up for declining gas tax revenue. Origo is a pay-per-mile program for EV and hybrid drivers. We first told you about this in January. It's a volunteer-only. It is volunteer only right now, and only around 700 people or so have signed up so far. The rate is just under 2 cents per mile. So they either report their mileage to the state or it's tracked using GPS devices. Because people driving hybrids are still buying gas at the pump, their account is balanced each quarter to credit the mileage fee against the gas tax so that they're not paying both. In order to make this program mandatory, though, lawmakers would have to pass a bill in the legislature. And because it's a tax program for revenue, it would need 3/5 majority approval. Now, there is a bill in Salem this session that would make this mandatory in 2027, but that's only for cars that are model year 2028 or later and rated for 30 miles per gallon or better, which would include EVs. So the bill has been sitting with the Joint Transportation Committee since late February with no upcoming hearings scheduled. So it's still a number of years off, effectively. By the way, those anti-tolling bills are also in that Joint Transportation Committee, co-chaired by Representative Susan McLean, who touched on the pay-per-mile program during our interview.
Well, the pilot that you're talking about, which has been a long pilot, 12 years, basically is a pilot that we have found to be successful, and we've found it to be comparable to the fuel tax, that folks that are paying by the mile or folks that are paying the fuel tax are basically paying about the same amount monetarily. So that's been interesting, and I think that's given us the feeling that we need to go forward with seeing that as a tool that we could use.
So add that to the future toolbox for legislators and ODOT. And if you'd like to learn more about Origo program, you can head to the KGW YouTube channel. Just scroll down to the story and then go back to our show from January 4th of this year. That's when we covered the pay-per-mile option as our big story that night. You can also visit myorigo.org. All right, keep sending your questions and your comments to thestory@kgw.com. We'll finish the show after the break, but first a little preview of what to expect at 6:30.
Straight ahead at 6:30, charged with murder. Why the wife of a man shot and killed over the weekend says it's because of a bag of chips. Plus, 2 major fentanyl busts, where authorities seized the drugs and how much they took off the streets. And enrollment woes hit Portland public schools hard. How many full-time positions could be gone by the fall? That's next at 6:30. Hope to see you then.
Well, we are at the end of our show now. Thanks so much for watching. Pat will be back tomorrow night. In the meantime, your news at 6:30.